fun of this. Welcome to the ultimate tanking guide for New World. Whether you're just starting out or you've been holding the line for your squad, this guide will cover everything you need to know to tank like a GigaChad. We're not just going to help you handle the physical damage, but you'll be ready to soak up any emotional damage thrown your way too. And believe me, that is half the battle. So get ready to gear up, position yourself like a boss, and pull off the ultimate defensive moves while making sure your DPS have the space they need to rain hell on the enemies. This video is going to be your one-stop shop for everything you need to become the best tank in New World. Let's begin by talking about the core concepts of tanking in New World, threat and taunts. If you want to be a successful tank, understanding these mechanics is absolutely essential. Many new players get confused by the difference, but they are the cornerstone of managing aggro and PvE content. Threat is the game's internal calculation that decides who the enemies are going to attack. It's essentially the value that determines which player on your team has the most aggro, and is influenced by several factors: damage dealt, healing, and your proximity to the mobs. Imagine you're at a party and the mobs are deciding who to focus. Whoever is causing the most ruckus, whether by damage or healing, is going to get all of the attention. But as a tank, your job is to make sure you are the center of attention, not your DPS or healers. So how do you make that happen? Well, that's where taunts come to play. Taunts are essentially an instant aggro grab. When you taunt an enemy, you're telling the game's threat system that you should be at the top of the threat table, at least for the duration of that taunt. But here's the thing, taunts don't generate any threat by themselves. Once the taunt ends, you need to have enough threat build up on your damage or your crowd control abilities. Once that taunt ends, you need to have built up enough threat through your damage or crowd control abilities to keep the enemy locked onto you. Let's go deeper into how you maintain threat after a taunt. A taunt gives you a short window where the enemy is focused on you, but it's your job to capitalize on that window. Threat is built primarily through damage. So the key is to maximize your damage output immediately after a taunt. So abilities like Shield Rush, Defiant Stance, or any high damage skill here are crucial. So abilities like Whirling Blade, Upheaval, or just getting in and light attacking are very crucial here. When it comes to taunting bosses, you do ideally want to taunt them before they actually land. So we call it pre-taunting. So you can use abilities like Defender's Resolve, Calamity Counter, etc. You can't use Shockwave or Rupture. And essentially, you'll start to learn when in the audio queue you can do it. But most bosses have an audio queue just before the actual health pops up. You want to be taunting at this point, so that way the aggro is on you before they even come up. Otherwise, as soon as that health bar pops, if you're taunting then, they can quickly turn on to a DPS or a healer. Taunts are a great tool, but they're not a permanent solution. So when your taunt is active, take your chance to lock down aggro by dishing out as much damage as possible. Use your abilities wisely, don't waste them before you taunt. Time your cooldown so that right after the taunt lands, you have a powerful ability or you have some auto attacks ready to go. But what do you do if you lose aggro mid-fight? This is where taunt cooldowns and positioning come into play. If you notice you're losing threat to another player, typically a DPS who's going all out, you can use your taunt to bring the enemy back to you. However, taunts don't stack, so don't use one if the mob is already targeting you, it won't do anything. Instead, save your taunts for when you lose aggro. Here's a big tip, always make sure you have line of sight when you're using your taunts. If you're behind a wall or an obstacle, the taunt is likely not going to work and you'll be left with a very angry DPS yelling at you in party chat. Now, let's talk about something that separates the good tanks from the great ones, positioning. Now, positioning isn't just about standing still and taking damage, it's about controlling the battlefield, controlling the mobs, and setting up your team for success. Think of positioning like anchoring the fight. You want to plant yourself in a spot where you can control the fight and where your DPS can safely deal damage from far behind. Think of positioning like anchoring the fight. So you want to plant yourself in a spot where you can control the fight when your DPS can safely deal the damage from behind. So a big mistake that new tanks make is constantly moving around the battlefield, chasing after mobs, trying to get those stray archers in the back. This here disrupts your DPS's positioning and it makes it really hard for them to do their job. If you run off chasing every loose mob, you're going to lose control of the main fight, and that's where things start to go sideways. So let's go a bit more into detail about how positioning impacts your team's performance as a tank. It's your job to not just hold aggro, but also create an optimal environment for your DPS. A well-positioned tank can make it easier for DPS to do consistent damage without having to constantly reposition themselves. Positioning is especially important for DPS. They really need to get behind the enemies to maximize their damage output. So if you're constantly just moving mobs around, turning them around, you're forcing them to waste precious seconds repositioning. There is a damage loss, and in tough fights, there can be the difference between success and failure. Especially if you're coming up against a big mob, there's some kind of swipe attack, you can end up killing your entire team. This is why it's crucial that you plant yourself in a good spot and avoid unnecessary movement. Once you have the attention of the mobs, hold your ground. Let your DPS move around you, not the other way. Here's another key point. Do not spin the enemies unless you absolutely have to. When you spin the boss or mob groups around too much, you're disrupting the DPS's ability to consistently hit from behind. It might not seem like much, but every time you spin the enemy, you're reducing your team's overall damage, and it's a highly likely chance they're going to get hit and die. Your goal is to maintain a steady position so that your DPS can focus on dealing damage instead of chasing after enemies or constantly having to readjust your position. It's all about creating stability within the fight and reducing the level of chaos. Next, let's dive into crowd control, or CC. Which is the most important aspect of being an effective tank. Crowd control isn't just about stopping enemies, it's about controlling the pace of the fight, making sure that you're never overwhelmed and giving your team the breathing room they need. We have 4 different types of CC here. We have stuns, which stops an enemy completely. They can't move, attack, or cast spells. You have staggers, which interrupt enemies and push them back slightly, temporarily disrupting their attacks. We have knockdowns, which drop enemies to the floor, completely disabling them for a brief moment. And we have roots, which hold enemies in place, preventing movement, but still allowing them to continue attacking. Each of these crowd control abilities have its own unique purpose, and knowing when and how to use them is what separates an average tank from a great one. Stuns are by far the most powerful form of crowd control. When an enemy is stunned, they're completely helpless for a few seconds. They can't move, they can't attack, and they can't cast. This is especially important when dealing with bosses or elite mobs that have grit, is that white bar and kind of haze around them that appears when an enemy is about to perform a powerful, uninterruptible attack. Stuns are one of the few ways to interrupt those attacks. So the key to using stuns effectively is timing. You don't want to just throw them out randomly, willy-nilly here and there. Just save them for critical moments when an enemy is about to land a heavy hit. Buy time for your healers or DPS to recover. Let's move on to staggers. Staggers don't completely stop enemies like stuns do, but they are still extremely useful for controlling the battlefield. Whether you stagger an enemy, you interrupt their attacks, and you push them back slightly, which buys you and your team time to reposition or deal more damage. Shield Rush, for example, is a great stagger ability that can disrupt multiple enemies at once. The pushback effect might not seem significant, but it can be the difference between your healer taking a hit or dodging in time. Staggers are also useful for spacing enemies out. If your team's being swarmed by mobs, a stagger can create enough space, allowing your DPS to focus on individual targets or being able to exit the pack. Another excellent stagger ability is Calamity Counter from the Greatsword, which can be charged for extra damage and control. This ability gives you a 2-in-1. The stagger disrupts enemy and the damage helps maintain your threat levels while being an active block and be able to block up to 4 incoming attacks. Next up, we have knockdowns. So knockdowns are similar to stuns, but instead of simply disabling an enemy, they physically drop them onto the ground. So when an enemy is knocked down, they're completely out of commission for a short period of time, which can give your team a much needed breather. Knockdowns are particularly useful when you're being overwhelmed by multiple enemies, or when you're up against particularly tough mobs that's dealing a lot of damage. Abilities like Wrecking Ball and Clear Out are perfect for controlling groups of enemies by knocking them down and taking them out of the fight completely. So knockdowns also work well when it's paired with another CC ability. For example, knocking down enemies after stunning them ensures that they're disabled for longer, which can make a huge difference in chaotic fights. So that's like going Clear Out into Wrecking Ball, into Shockwave, just keeping those enemies on the floor. Finally, let's talk about roots. So roots are a little bit different from stuns, staggers, and knockdowns because they don't stop an enemy from attacking. All they do is stop them from moving, which means while they're rooted, enemies can't chase you and they can't chase your team around, but they can still hit anyone within range. Roots are great for controlling where enemies move, but you do need to be careful when using them. So if your team's within range, those enemies will still be attacking, and you can end up ruining abilities like a grab whale trying to group your enemies tighter. The key to using roots effectively is positioning. Use them when you need to keep enemies in place while your team is either moving away or setting up for a burst of damage. The key to using roots effectively is positioning. Use them when you need to keep enemies in place for your team to deal damage. So one of the most notable roots is Binds. That one there, you really want to be using it after a grab well or something. Once you've grouped your enemies together, pop the vines and it will hold everything in place. By combining roots with other crowd control abilities, you can completely control the flow of the fight, ensuring the enemies stay exactly where you want them while your team takes them down one by one. Now we've covered crowd control, let's dive into one of the most important decisions you'll make as a tank, your weapon pairing. In New World, your choice of weapons will greatly influence your playstyle. While there are lots of combinations out there, two of the most effective and commonly used setups are Greatsword and Hammer, and Sword and Shield. Let's start with the Greatsword and Hammer combination. This is one of the most powerful tanking setups, especially if you're looking to maximize your crowd control and damage output. The Greatsword offers some of the best versatility in terms of damage and crowd control with abilities like Calamity Counter, which not only staggers enemies, but also deals heavy damage when charged. And the Greatsword is perfect for controlling the battlefield while maintaining a high threat level. One of the key advantages of the Greatsword is its mobility and its ability to generate a lot of threat. You can relentless rush into a mob pack to position exactly where you want to be, open up with a Rupture for some early grouping and taunt. You then look at holding Calamity Counter. Hold this for a couple seconds as it will help taunt any stragglers in the far end and it will block any of those initial attacks coming in. Push Calamity Counter again. This will give the mobs a little bit of a stagger and then you can just look at slapping them with the heavy attacks using your active blocking and defensive stance, which will keep you very, very safe. The Hammer complements the Greatsword perfectly with abilities like Shockwave, which stuns enemies in a large area, Wrecking Ball, which knocks enemies down, and Clear Out, which also knocks enemies down and rends them if you have the Sundering Clear Out perk. The Hammer provides incredible crowd control potential when you're up against large groups of mobs. The Hammer's AoE control is invaluable. So this combination is particularly effective for dealing with large packs of mobs in dungeons or open world content. The Greatsword's damage and aggro control combined with the Hammer's crowd control abilities does ensure that you can hold aggro on multiple enemies while keeping them locked down. Now let's talk about the Sword and Shield. So this is a quintessential tanking setup in New World, offering the highest defense and utility for both yourself and your team. If you're new to tanking, this is generally the weapon choice. So you can either go Sword and Shield and Greatsword if you want to have that mobility and easy taunts of the Greatsword, or you can go Sword and Shield and Hammer if you want that kind of CC ability of the Hammer. The Sword and Shield combo is all about survivability and controlling the pace of the fight. Abilities like Defender's Resolve give you incredible boost in damage reduction, making you almost unkillable for the duration. This is your go-to ability when you need to survive high burst damage or when your healer needs a moment to catch up. That doesn't make sense. This is your go-to ability when you need to survive higher damage and taunt faraway mobs. So another core ability in the Sword and Shield's kit is Whirling Blade. Now, depending on your armor weight, it's going to do different things here. If you're a bit more of an advanced tank and you're going light, then it offers rend on all the targets that it hits. But if you're going heavy armor, it offers weaken as well, causing the mobs hit by it to do less damage. Last up, I usually recommend Upheaval, otherwise known as Reverse Stab. Now, this here gives you an amazing cooldown reduction, allowing you to use Defender's Resolve much quicker. So the real strength of the Sword and Shield combination lies in its ability to mitigate damage while maintaining aggro on high priority targets. In a coordinated group, this is your go-to setup for surviving the toughest bosses, especially when your team needs a reliable tank to absorb heavy hits. So the choice between Greatsword and Hammer and Sword and Shield and Hammer, or even Sword and Shield and Greatsword, really depends on the content you're running and your playstyle. Greatsword and Hammer provide more crowd control and more mobility, which is perfect for controlling large groups of enemies, while Sword and Shield offers the best defensive utility and also empowers the team when you use leadership, making it ideal for tanking bosses, surviving tougher content, and helping boost your DPS's damage. Ultimately, both weapon pairings are pretty powerful for tanking in New World, and knowing when to use each one will make you more versatile and a more effective tank. Now that we've covered the weapon pairings, let's dive into your armor and your stats. As a tank in New World, your armor choice will greatly affect your survivability and effectiveness in battle. There is a common debate whether wearing heavy armor for maximum defense or going for light armor for mobility. Let's break down the pros and cons of each. So starting with heavy armor, this is your go-to for survivability. Heavy armor offers the best damage mitigation, allowing you to absorb more hits and stay in the fight longer. When you're just starting out as a tank, or if you're tackling high-end content, expeditions, raids, etc., heavy armor is your best bet You'll be able to take more hits, which gives your healer more time to react and keep you alive. With heavy armor, you can survive longer, but you will be sacrificing some mobility and damage. Light armor does grant you a 20% base damage bonus, which is great for tanks looking to maximize their damage output, but the downside is you'll be much more vulnerable to incoming attacks, which means you really need to rely on dodging and positioning more than blocking. So when should you choose light armor? Generally, light armor is better suited for more experienced tanks who are confident in their positioning and their dodging skills. It allows you to get to pulls faster, deal more damage, and react quickly to incoming threats. However, you're going to be much squishier. So you do need to be precise with your crowd control and positioning, and you do need to have a decent team around you supporting you when it comes to weakens and CCs and healing. In most cases though, especially for newer tanks or for tough bosses, heavy armor is the way to go. It offers the best combination of survivability and utility, and you can always just drop your con down a little bit as you start getting used to taking more damage. That will increase your outgoing damage while getting you used to just having to dodge some more of those mechanics. While you don't deal as much damage in heavy as you would in light, your primary job as a tank is to survive and keep the enemies focused on you. So that survivability is well worth it. When you're choosing your armor pieces, you'll want to look for certain perks that enhance your tanking capabilities. What I always recommend is as much enchanted ward as possible. If you can have 5, sometimes the artifact you're using will push you down to 4. Then you want 4 refreshing pieces. If you want with your refreshing, you can have this on your earring and your amulet, meaning you only need to take 2 on your armor. And then I highly recommend taking 5 slash conditioning. So almost every mob you're going to come across, especially those pesky little crawlers and creepers, they all do slash damage. So this is going to give you another 25% ABS. So it's absolute. So a flat 25% damage reduction against those slash attacks. Now let's talk about stat distribution. As a tank, you'll want to strike a balance between strength and constitution. Ideally, you should aim for 300 strength and 300 con split. This will give you enough damage to generate threat and hold aggro while providing the durability you need to survive tough fights. So strength increases your melee damage, which directly helps you generate more threat. The more damage you deal, the more threat you're going to build. So it is important to have a solid amount of strength in your stat build. On the other hand, constitution boosts your health and survivability. So with more constitution, you'll be able to absorb more hits before going down, which is especially important when you're dealing with bosses that hit hard. The extra health pool gives your healer more time to react and keep you alive. This 300-300 split is going to be ideal for most tanking situations, but you can adjust it depending on the content you're running. So for example, if you're a more DPS heavy group, you might want to increase your constitution to 350 to ensure that you stay alive while your DPS focus. For example, if you're taking a lot of damage and you're dying easily, you might want to bump up their constitution to 350 to ensure that you stay alive while your DPS can focus on burning down mobs and bosses. You do need to be mindful though, the higher your con goes, the higher the chances you're going to lose aggro. When it comes to getting 725, you're more or less locked into 300-350 splits. So I think for the average player there, 300 strength and 350 con will be really good because you do get that damage reduction with grit at 350 con. So when it comes to gems, carnelian gems are a must for tanks. These convert your damage into threat. So this makes it easy. So you always want to focus gems that increase your defensive. So for physical defense, Onyx a really great option. Moonstone or Jaspers for slash or strike. Or if you're doing mutations, you want to run all of the gems matching the mutation you're running, or the recommended protections for the boss or content that you're doing. If you are struggling knowing what gems or protection you need to run for different content, check out the website newbuilds.com. We do have everything on there. So by balancing your armor, your stats, and your gem, you'll be maximizing your effectiveness as a tank. Whether you're facing off against a tough boss or you're tanking a group of mobs in a dungeon, always be ready to adjust your build based on the content and needs of your team. Now that you've got your army, your stats, and your gem sorted, let's talk about the perks and abilities that will take your tanking to the next level. Choosing the right perks is critical to maximizing your effectiveness as a tank, whether it's reducing your cooldowns, boosting your survivability, or improving your ability to control the battlefield. So some peak priorities are refreshing move / conditioning. If you're using a tower shield, you want to look at shield wards on there. So it works similar to an amulet, so you can have any of the physical protections / strike thrust, or you can have any of the elemental protections on there as well, so you can match that to the content you're doing. I also highly recommend, if you're going for a more defensive build, to have Enchanted Ward on your shield, as it does also work when you're on your offhand. So when you're tanking, Refreshing Move is really important as well. This perk reduces your cooldown every time you land a light or a heavy attack, and as a tank you'll be relying heavily on your taunt abilities and crowd control, so anything that reduces your cooldowns is invaluable. The more often you can use your abilities, the more control you'll have over the fight. Now whether you're taking Reverse Stab, otherwise known as Upheaval, or Fortifying Shield Rush will depend. If you're taking Shield Rush, then you do want to take Fortifying Shield Rush. This here will give you an amazing amount of Fortify whenever you land it on a mob, increasing your overall physical and elemental protection. With Fortifying Shield Rush, you're not only dealing damage and controlling the enemy with your shield, but you're also fortifying yourself, which boosts your defense. This perk is especially useful during boss fights when you need to survive heavy hits when your team is focusing on damage. On the other hand, if you're going for Upheaval, you don't necessarily need the perk for it, but if you do have space in your armor, then you may as well slot it in. Now that we've covered some perks, let's dive into the weapon abilities that you'll want to focus on. Each weapon has its own set of abilities, but there are a few core abilities that are essential to maintaining aggro, controlling the battlefield, and surviving heavy damage. First up, we have Defender's Resolve, one of the strongest tanking abilities in the game. This ability significantly reduces incoming damage while also taunting nearby enemies. It is your go-to for surviving high damage situations. Depending on whether you have a round shield or a tower shield, you will get different effects from this. If you're running a round shield, you'll be getting extra base damage. If you're running a tower shield, you'll have extra protection. When it comes to Whirling Blade, this here is one of your main weapon abilities. So if you're taking the Butcher, you also get a lot of extra bleed damage applying to this, which it also has a lot of inbuilt cooldown. So when you're using it in really large packs, you can pretty much helicopter away and just perma use that Whirling Blade, and you're going to do crazy damage while almost instantly charging up your heart rune. For Upheaval, this one here, you're more or less just using this as a cooldown reduction tool. It does do some good damage, but we really are just looking at it for that cooldown reduction. Now for a bit of a look at the Warhammer abilities. With the Warhammer, you do want to be chaining in light attacks in between your abilities. So let's say you want to open up with Shockwave, 2 light attacks, Wrecking Ball, 2 light attacks, Clear Out. Pretty much by the time you've gone through that rotation, your cooldowns are going to be back up and you can almost permanently CC any mobs. So the beauty of Shockwave is that it affects multiple enemies at once, allowing you to lock down the entire group by stunning them all at once. When you're CCing mobs like this, it gives your DPS time to burn them down without worrying about having to take any hits themselves. So you do want to look at taking Sundering Shockwave or Sundering Clear Out on your hammer, as this will apply rends to the targets that it's hit. Rend reduces their armor and will increase the damage that your team's dealing. With Wrecking Ball, this one here is a nice easy slam. You kind of jump up in the air and slam down with your hammer, knocking the enemies to the ground. Where Clear Out, it's almost like you chuck your hammer on a chain and swing it around in circles and knock down all the enemies around you. When it comes to the Greatsword, you have your 3 abilities. You have Relentless Rush, you have Calamity Counter, and you have Rupture. So Relentless Rush is a spinning attack that does allow you to go through enemies. It is really good as a tank because when you're opening up fights, you can spin through the enemies to the other side where you want to be positioned to fight and straight away be in the right spot. I do believe Grace is going to be a good option for tanking because it's going to give you a lot of haste. So if you're heavy tanking, it's going to give you a lot of haste to be running. But you can also put Relentless Freedom on this. So when you're using Relentless Rush, if you get rooted from anything, you can use Relentless to get out of that and carry on with the fight. Rupture, you'd want to be using this after you use Relentless Rush, as that puts you in Onslaught stance. Then that way when you use Rupture, it's almost like a mini Gravwell pulling in the mobs towards you, and it taunts enemies. This here will give you a little bit of Fortify and it will stop you being interrupted and kind of bonked around while you're trying to get set up. Then Calamity Counter is almost like a blocking attack. You hold it up, you'll be able to block, I believe, 4 attacks. So I'd usually use this after the Rupture. Hold that Calamity Counter for a couple seconds until the team kind of gets settled in. You get your heals down. It is an AoE taunt. You pop that Calamity Counter again. It'll stagger the enemies and away you go. So now that we've covered the basics, let's dive into some advanced tips and strategies that will help you become an even better tank in New World. So these tips are geared more towards tanks who want to push their gameplay to the next level, whether it's by optimizing their threat generation or improving their positioning or mastering their cooldown management. So as a tank, your ability to hold aggro is directly tied to how well you generate threat. So in addition to using taunts, you should really focus on how much damage you're dealing. Remember, damage equals threat, so the more damage you deal, the easier it'll be to hold aggro. Managing your cooldowns is crucial for threat generation. So the more you can use your abilities, the more you'll generate. This is where perks like Refreshing Move or upheaval that we talked about earlier becomes invaluable as they reduce those cooldowns, allowing you to taunt and deal more damage more frequently. Let's talk about positioning next, a critical aspect of advanced tanking that can make or break a fight. As we've discussed earlier, your role as a tank isn't just about taking damage, it's about controlling where the fight takes place. Positioning yourself correctly can significantly reduce the chances of your DPS or healer getting hit and can increase your team's overall damage output. One of the best ways to optimize your positioning is by keeping mobs grouped up in one spot. Enemies are tightly grouped, your AoE abilities such as Shockwave, Calamity Counter will hit more targets, helping generate more threat. You really want to be looking at grouping on ranged mobs. So if you've got a large pack of enemies and you've got some ranged mobs, try and take everything to the archers and fight there. Otherwise, if there's an archer or a mage or something off to the side, they'll likely aggro onto your healer, as healers have like a base level of aggro. And if that happens, your healer goes down, you go down, and everything falls apart. A good tank always positions the mobs so that the DPS can attack from behind or at least from the side. Most DPS classes in you will benefit from hitting enemies from behind, as it increases the damage and crit chance. So just keep the mobs facing you. Usually, let's say you're in a boss fight or you've got some mobs, try and get your back tucked into a wall or a corner or something. This will stop you getting pushed around too much. And then that way, the mobs or the boss have their back facing the open space, giving your DPS and the healer much more space to work with. So another important aspect of positioning is making sure you're on flat ground. As we mentioned before, elevation can mess with hit detection. If you're fighting on uneven terrain, your abilities might miss. And sometimes out of nowhere, there might be a small boulder or something you stand on, you can just lose threat instantly. So whenever possible, just pull enemies to flat ground, just hold them there. So let's move on to cooldown management. As a tank, you do rely heavily on your taunts and your CC abilities. Managing these cooldowns effectively is essential to maintaining the control of the fight. The key is to rotate your abilities in such a way that you always have taunt or crowd control abilities available when you need them. So this is like we spoke about earlier when it comes to your hammer abilities, chaining light attacks in between to get those cooldowns back up. Or when you're on the sword and shield, let's say you've used Defender's Resolve, keep smacking away. If you've got refreshing move, use your upheaval. Just keep smacking away to get that cooldown down. If you do use Defender's Resolve, you don't really want to switch off until the time limit's out, because as soon as you switch weapons, it will remove that buff. Let's have a bit of a chat about proactively using your abilities. So a great tank doesn't wait until things go wrong to use their cooldowns. They need to anticipate the flow of the fight and use your abilities before they're needed. So like, let's say you know a boss is about to use a really heavy hitting ability. Instead of waiting to see if you can survive, pop Defender's Resolve or Stone Form, or even hit a dodge. By preemptively using these defensive abilities, you can avoid getting into dangerous situations. It is important to dodge attacks as a tank. So if a boss is going to do a big slam attack, something like that, don't feel like you just need to eat every single shot. Do try and dodge some of these abilities. It'll take a lot of pressure off of your healer. So the same proactive approach needs to apply to crowd control. If you know a group of enemies is about to swarm you, use Shockwave or Wrecking Ball and just stun them before they become a problem. Anticipating the enemy movements and acting ahead of time will make you more effective tank. By staying one step ahead of the fight, you'll keep your team safer, you'll generate more threat, and you'll maintain control of the battlefield. Always remember, a proactive tank is a better tank. Lastly, let's discuss communication. So one of the most overlooked aspects of tanking is how well you communicate with your team. A really good tank keeps their team informed about positioning and enemy movements and when big attacks are coming. Let your team know when you're about to use a taunt, when the group of enemies is about to be stunned, or when a boss is about to unleash a heavy attack. This allows your DPS and your healer to react accordingly, whether it's moved to a safer position or preparing for a big burst of damage during crowd control window. Something as simple as just pinging on the ground where you expect to be fighting a pack of mobs can really help your healer as well. If you're running with a random healer or someone you don't normally run with, they don't necessarily know where you're going to be fighting, and it can get a little bit confusing. So something as little as just popping a ping on the ground where you're planning on stopping, they know that that's where you're going to be fighting, can completely change the pace of a run. So just keeping everyone on the same page, you can prevent a lot of mistakes and keep the fight under control. So for example, if your DPS know that a taunt are about to wear off, they can hold back on their damage for a moment, just in case they're going to pull aggro if you haven't built up enough threat. Otherwise, if your healer knows you're about to take a big hit, they can prepare, they can get their heals back up. So just really make sure you're communicating with your team. We've covered a lot of ground in this tanking guide, from understanding threat and taunts to mastering your positioning, crowd control, and cooldown management. So whether you're a new tank, you're just starting out, or you're a seasoned player looking to refine your skills, these principles will help you become the rock your team can always rely on. Let's just quickly recap the most important points that will elevate your tanking to the next level. So first, understanding threat and taunts is key. Always remember that taunts temporarily place you at the top of the threat table, but they don't generate long-term threat by themselves. Your job is to use damage and crowd control to build threat during the taunt window. The more damage that you deal, the more threat you're going to generate. So use abilities Shield Bash, Calamity Counter, Shockwave. Keep the enemies focused on you. Next, positioning is crucial for controlling the fight. As a tank, you dictate where the enemies stand, and it's your job to make sure they're grouped up and facing you so the DPS can do their job. Always aim to keep the fight on flat ground, giving your DPS as much space as possible, and avoid spinning mobs too much. Stability and just keeping things unchaotic and as stable as possible is the key to maximizing your team's damage output. We also talked about the importance of crowd control. As a tank, your stuns, staggers, knockdowns, and roots are your tools for controlling the flow of the fight. Use abilities like Shockwave, a Shield Bash, Wrecking Ball, and Calamity Counter to keep enemies locked down. Timing is everything when it comes to crowd control. Use it when your team needs breathing room or when the enemies are about to unleash powerful attacks. The more control you exert over the battlefield, the easier it's going to be for your team to do their job. Weapon pairing was the last critical point of tanking. Weapon pairing is another critical point of tanking. We covered a couple options there for you. So choosing the weapon combination that best fits your playstyle and the content you're running is ideal for controlling large groups of mobs. So just choose the weapon combination that best. So just choose the best weapon combination that best fits your playstyle and the content that you are running. We talked about the importance of some stats and gear, a balance of 300 strength, 300 con, ensuring you have your carnelian gems ensuring you have your carnelians to generate extra threat, the importance of enchanted ward, refreshing / conditioning, and health. Keeping in mind some important perks like refreshing move. So by mastering these techniques, understanding threat, positioning yourself properly, using crowd control effectively, and optimizing your gear, you'll become a tank that your team can always rely on. Tanking isn't just about surviving, it's about controlling the fight and making sure your team has everything they need. To succeed. Thanks for watching this guide. If you want more tanking tips or you want to just hang out, stop by my stream or check out more newer content on my channel. And remember, always tank big, live big, and enjoy the attention. And remember, always tank big, live big, and love the attention. See you in Aeternum. Nah. And remember, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And I'll see you on the next one.